Zimbabwe is a southern African country known for its dramatic landscape, wonderful culture, diverse wildlife, and of course abundant resources, which unfortunately caught the ambitious eyes of the British Empire in the 1800s. With the help of Christian missionaries, such as John Moffat, who tricked Lobengula, leader of the Ndebele tribe, into signing treaties with the British, in exchange for protection, the British were able to gain control of the region. Those treaties granted land and mineral rights to Cecil John Rhodes, who obtained a royal charter from the British government to invade the land. And, by 1890, the invasion of the region began until it was fully conquered and named Southern Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes, who oversaw the conquest. Rhodes was famous for his racist views towards the people of the region, hence it was no surprise that separation of the races in the economy, political system, and law became the order of the day. Just like what happened during the apartheid era in South Africa, the blacks were separated from the white colonial settlers. It was illegal for a local man to have sexual relations with a white woman, but it was perfectly okay for a white man to have sexual relations with a black woman. Land belonging to the locals was seized and given to the white settlers, who used the locals as chea laborers to cultivate the land for farming purposes. In the words of Cecil Rhodes, "It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes. That more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, the most honorable race the world possesses." So land dispossession became the norm, and the locals were driven from their own lands. However, in 1965, when African countries began to gain independence from other colonial masters, the Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia, Ian Smith, fearing the return of black majority rule as a result of the growing calls for independence, declared independence from Britain and renamed the region Rhodesia. This move was to ensure that the white minority continued to maintain influence over the country, and it came as the natives began to demand to reclaim their land. Just like other African countries, Rhodesia experienced a prolonged and violent struggle for the liberation of their land from the white minority rulers. One of the prominent figures leading this movement was R.Mugabe, then leader of the largest and most secretive African guerrilla army, standing against the white minority government of Rhodesia. And like any African who dared to defy the West, Mugabe was labeled a terrorist and branded as a man who massacred his own people. In the early 1970s, another prominent leader of the Rhodesian liberation movement, ZANU military commander Josiah Tongagara, traveled to China to receive military training during the Rhodesian Bush War, and also to establish connections with other liberation movement and communist countries supporting the struggle against white minority rule. This training contributed to Tongagara's military skills and leadership abilities. The Soviet Union, as well as other communist parties, provided support in the form of weapons and ammunition to the military wings of the liberation movement in Rhodesia. International isolation of the white minority government in Rhodesia and the guerrilla warfare, led by black nationalists, resulted in negotiations during the Lancaster House Conference in 1979. There, the groundwork was laid for the transition to majority rule, a new constitution, and provisions for democratic elections. This eventually led to elections in February 1980, an election won by R.Mugabe of the ZANU Patriotic Front Party. Following the election, the country was officially renamed the Republic of Zimbabwe in the same year. However, the fight was not over. While the Lancaster Agreement set the stage for Zimbabwe's independence, later actions from the British government revealed that it was a sham. Although the black majority now ruled the country, things remained the same because the land and all the valuable resources that came with it still belonged to the British settlers. So the majority of the black population continued to work as cheap labor for the white farm owners, who treated them like animals. The Lancaster Agreement did not return the stolen land, which rightly belonged to the blacks. Instead, it introduced a market-based system known as a willing buyer and a willing seller, whereby the newly elected government of Zimbabwe would have to buy the stolen lands in British pounds or US dollars from the white farmers who were descendants of the British invaders. Imagine that. But that's not even the worst of it. Not only did they have to buy back what belonged to them, but the value of the land was determined by the white settlers. At the time, 95% of the Zimbabwean economy was controlled by Europeans and Americans. So imagine how difficult it would be for the locals who had nothing to buy back their land. Over time, the Zimbabwean government, led by R.Mugabe, got frustrated with the pace of the land reforms. Those African veterans who fought and risked their lives for the independence of the country started to occupy the stolen lands, including the farms of the white settlers. The Zimbabwean government had no choice but to accept the will of the people, and in June 2000, the government announced that it would begin to seize white-owned farms. About 3,000 white-owned farms were seized, and thousands of black Zimbabweans were resettled on the land. This move, however, proved to be fatal because it made the United States and the European Union angry, which led to them imposing some of the worst and most severe sanctions on Zimbabwe. In 2002, the European Union imposed a travel ban on key government officials, and the assets of many Zimbabwean officials were seized. Officially, the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe were justified by the West by citing human rights abuse and the undermining of democracy. The sanctions were called targeted measures against Zimbabwe, which sounds fancy but in reality had a disastrous impact on the Zimbabwean economy. In 2003, US President George W. Bush issued an executive order, which, according to experts, was actually a declaration of war on Zimbabwe by the United States government. The US declared Zimbabwe an extraordinary threat to the US government, and a national emergency was declared. Under this declaration, either the US intervened militarily or imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. It chose economic sanctions and called it a targeted sanctions program. Under this program, no US or foreign companies were allowed to deal with the Zimbabwe government. It also gave an ultimatum for the Zimbabwean government to respect human rights and return the rich farmlands to the British settlers, or else the US would halt all Zimbabwean dealings with the IMF and World Bank. In addition, all the debt would have to be paid in full. The Industrial Development Corporation of Zimbabwe, the state-owned enterprise responsible for investing, promoting, and facilitating industrial development in Zimbabwe, was completely blacklisted, and all its foreign funds were frozen. The US sanctions also prevented money from flowing into the country, and foreign banks were prohibited from dealing with Zimbabwean banks. Any bank that ignored the sanctions was fined heavily. So, these sanctions isolated Zimbabwe, leading to stagnation in its development. The country was unable to access credit and was prevented from trading in the international market. The US prevented Zimbabwe from importing new technology, fertilizers, medicine, and spare parts, rendering various sectors of the economy obsolete. You can imagine how all these affected the Zimbabwean black population. The drought experienced during that period exacerbated the whole situation, leading to reduced agricultural productivity and a worsening food crisis. The interesting thing is that, until today, Western media believed that the sanctions were not the cause of the food crisis in Zimbabwe. Rather, the media says that it was because R.Mugabe seized the farms from white farmers and gave them to black farmers who did not have the required skills to farm the land. And when the Zimbabwean dollar, marked by hyperinflation, collapsed in the late 2000s, so much so that its value plummeted to the point where trillion-dollar notes became worthless, the media says it was solely because of mismanagement of the economy by the administration of Mugabe. However, the fact is that the sanctions played a huge role in making the Zimbabwean economy collapse. However, while Zimbabwe was struggling under this crisis, China appeared as a beacon of hope to the Zimbabwean people and helped to support the nation against US sanctions. By providing financial aid, investment, and diplomatic backing, China helped Zimbabwe mitigate the economic effects of the sanctions. China invested in Zimbabwe's infrastructure, mining, and agricultural sectors, and extended loans and lines of credit to enable Zimbabwe to have access to funds and resources restricted by the West. Not only did China provide financial support, but in 2008, China and Russia voted against the UN's plans, headed by the US, to place additional sanctions on Zimbabwe. On several occasions, China has also made calls for the sanctions on Zimbabwe to be lifted, and finally, the sanctions, which lasted for 23 years, were lifted recently. These sanctions were lifted as a result of calls made by human rights activists in Zimbabwe and China. Hopefully, the country will begin to recover now that it is no longer under sanctions. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.